Freada Kapor Klein, thank you so much for sitting down with Forbes for the 50 over 50.
It's my pleasure, and I'm way over 50.
You're not just over 50, you're over 70.
I am 72, looking at 73 very soon.
You are an entrepreneur. You are the founding partner of Kapor Capital and Kapor Center for Social Impact. You are an author. You are an activist. Do you feel like your career over the age of 50 has been more powerful than the years before 50?
Absolutely.
Why?
Some of it is what I've learned along the way. Some of it is, I think, what happens to many of us as we age, which is we care a lot less about other people's opinions. We say, okay, whatever held us back previously, we don't know how much time we have left on this earth, and let's go for it.
Let's go for it. You know, you have been called, I want to get this right, the moral center of Silicon Valley and an OG in technology. How does that title sit with you? Is it a heavy burden?
No, it's flattering, it's amusing. I emphasize the O part of everything. And I take it as a badge of honor and an inspiration to keep doing more.
But to be called the moral center of Silicon Valley, let's get into it. How did that title come to you?
Well, first of all, the moral center of Silicon Valley is a very low bar. So I think it's possible to jump over it, even being as short as I am. I think it came about because several actions and public statements that I've made are about staying true to my values instead of loyal to a certain insular group. So for instance, when we wrote our public letter to the Uber board about feeling that things had gone too far with the toxic culture, many venture capitalists felt that that was sort of breaking the code, that you should never speak out about a founder in a negative way. My view is companies have a responsibility about the culture that they build and how they treat their employees. And if we've tried to deliver a message about you've crossed the line, let's help you build a better culture, and they haven't listened, and they haven't listened, and they haven't listened, then we have an obligation to speak up, not to be loyal to someone no matter what their behavior is.
And of course, you were an early investor in Uber and also some other companies that are pretty well known, Asana, Dropcan, Twilio. And you had been working behind the scenes at Uber for a while to try to help clean up culture, because that had been your longtime organizational focus in your career.
Exactly.
But we reached a point with Uber culture in 2016, 2017 that it became necessary for you to speak out. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. It really, Uber did a lot of amazing things. Uber launched a whole new industry. And there were many lines that Uber crossed. Now, one question is, crossing the line with the taxi industry, had they waited for permission, they never would have gotten it. And that's one of the things that I love about disruptive innovation and startups. But some of the lines they crossed with respect to how employees were treated, how employees treated each other, the culture that tolerated excess of all kinds of sexual harassment, of racism, of drinking, those things just went way, way, way out of line. We did try to raise that issue to senior management on multiple occasions. I went and spoke to all of the ERGs, employee resource groups, when they came together globally. I had women from the women engineering groups reaching out to me quietly, and tried to do something that I've done my whole career, which is to protect those who are most vulnerable, to create a safe space for them to speak out, and then to relay those messages to senior management and say, look, this isn't good for your brand, this isn't good for retention, this isn't good for your long-term profitability, and it's a terrible way to treat people.
You took a decent amount of courage to write that Uber letter, and Silicon Valley, your peers, judged you for it. We're sitting in a moment where there is one very large tech company whose founder and CEO has been a little distracted by politics. I'm talking, of course, about Tesla's Elon Musk, and there are some calls for his board and or investors to be more outspoken. If you were on the board of Tesla or a big investor of Tesla, would you be speaking out right now?
Great question. I think I probably would. There are lines that shouldn't be crossed. And when I talk about bias, when I talk about unearned advantage, I don't think you should buy a presidency. I don't think you should buy a way into the White House. And I think that that's problematic. You might have a temporary advantage in your company, and we've seen it's been mixed, not necessarily a full advantage. I think it has terrible consequences for democracy.
As you talk about protecting the most vulnerable, you have focused most of your career on creating change, positive change in some capacity, and you didn't start in Silicon Valley or investing. Can you talk about your first work experiences or your first experiences with activism? What was the spark?
My first experience with activism actually is back to middle school, where I'm a terrible role model, and I don't tell our high school kids in our program this. I used to cut school and go picket for the farm workers. So being an activist has been woven into everything that I've done as my career has evolved. I co-founded the first group on sexual harassment that focused exclusively on sexual harassment in 1976. It wasn't even illegal behavior back then. And that got me into a deep interest in what makes for good organizational culture. How do you build a positive culture within a growing and profitable business? So that's what got me interested in business. So what I did is I followed the trail to where's the center of power. And what that leads to is, unfortunately or fortunately, that leads to money. And so the closer you are to making financial decisions, the more power you have to create change.
Money is, of course, power. And I've heard you say before that you can almost tie a direct line from your early work in sexual harassment work, or even in college, you worked for, volunteered for a rape center, a rape treatment center, is that correct?
Yes, that was part of my field work as an undergraduate.
You can draw a line from that work to the bias that we see in Silicon Valley and really corporate America writ large, is that correct?
Absolutely correct. That you can see, whether it's a rape crisis center, whether it's sexual harassment, you can see that people are treated or mistreated or abused in certain ways simply because of their demographics. And if you follow that line, you see that into who gets into good schools, who gets into the schools that are the feeder schools for technology companies or for startups or for venture capital. And so the through line is about identifying and disrupting bias.
And how do you do that?
Well, easier said than done, as we are seeing with the hills and valleys, the peaks and valleys of fighting bias in this country, in this society, in corporate culture. But what neuroscience teaches us is that the human brain is wired to be biased. And by that we mean associating two things together. And so it's probably how our foremothers and forefathers could remember, if I eat that mushroom, I'll die. And if I eat that mushroom, I'll get high. And how do you remember these things that keep the species going? So when we talk about bias, it's just about associating two things together. What happens, how it plays out in terms of workplace bias that limits people's opportunities, is we associate gender or race or a school that someone attended, we associate that with positive or negative abilities, attributes, capacities, and we get very far away from a level playing field. We get very far away from a meritocracy, which we, I think, believe in this country.
We do, though the way it has entered conversation in the last year or two has changed. But I like the way you often frame it, which is closing gaps, which kind of takes some of the more divisive terms out of it. Do you find that people are more receptive when you talk about evening the playing field and making a fairer entrepreneurial ecosystem for all?
That generally is a more palatable and more accessible way of describing the problem, which is sort of, let's close the gaps between haves and have-nots. Let's get rid of unfair advantage. Nobody should be jumping the line. Nobody should be paying to get to the front of the line. That we should really have a level playing field. We should have an even competition. Competition is great. Competition's important. We get many societal advances, and many tech companies come from that competition, but we need a fair competition. A fair competition is not when some people are born on third base and some people are born miles and miles and miles from the ball field and can't even get there to play.
Now, of course, when we talk about building companies and getting investment, we see a lot of folks who start on third base, whether it be through connections or family or what have you. Can you talk about what you've built at Kapor Capital, and also why, when you talk about your financial success, you don't include some of those names that I mentioned earlier, the Asanas, the Twilios, the Ubers of the world, which have had tremendous return, but you don't factor that in when talking about the returns Kapor Capital has achieved?
Starting in 2011, we decided to embark on a big experiment, which is to look at whether or not a venture capital portfolio built entirely of tech startups whose core business closed gaps of access, opportunity, or outcome for low-income communities and/or communities of color, whether that type of portfolio could, in fact, earn top quartile returns. And so some of those great successes, weren't fully gap closing. Some aspects of each of those companies are gap closing, but we were looking for 100% of the company was producing either products or services who were gap closing. So 2011 began our gap closing mission, and that's what we count when we get to something like our 2019 impact report, where we did indeed achieve top quartile financial returns.
You calculated that between 2011 and 2017, your internal rate of return was 29%. How does that compare to the VC industry writ large?
It certainly puts us well in the top quartile financial returns.
Top quartile financial returns with an impact focus. Have you done an updated look at that?
We've done several impact reports, and I'm no longer a GP at Kapor Capital. I've stepped back. We are Kapor Capital's largest LP, but Kapor Capital has continued with the same DNA, same investment criteria, and has continued to earn top quartile financial returns with 100% gap closing portfolio.
And you also have this really interesting founder's commitment that's baked into what you ask of your portfolio companies. You instituted this in 2016, and we believe this was among the first in Silicon Valley. Can you talk about this?
The founder's commitment, you're absolutely right. It was implemented in January of 2016, quite a while ago. And I think it's really important to give credit where credit's due. Our founders. Our founders came to us. We were running a focus group. We were going to hire our first portfolio services director. And we said, what should this person be doing? How can we help you? And our founders said, you know what? It's really difficult competing for talent with big tech. The salaries they pay, the equity. So what we want is to be able to signal, and they actually said, we want the equivalent of the Good Housekeeping seal of approval. We want to be able to say to people who care about the mission of the companies that we're a gap closing company, and to say that's what it means to be at Kapor Capital. And so we started the founder's commitment, and we wouldn't ever impose it retroactively. That's unfair. So it was going forward. 75% of our existing portfolio in 2016 said, wait, can't we sign on too? there was just this real pent-up demand to say, this is who we are, and we want to attract engineers and other talent who believe in gap-closing companies.
And just to be clear, when we talk about your portfolio companies, you are primarily investing relatively at the seed stage?
Yes, absolutely. Seed is the sweet spot. Occasionally pre-seed, occasionally will come in later, but seed has been where we've focused most of our attention, with some follow-on.
Why is that? Because I was looking at rates of success, and of course there's a higher chance of failure among seed stage than there are at Series A or Series B.
Well, I love seed stage. Seed stage is where you find incredible inspiration. You find these entrepreneurs who are passionate about a problem that they want to solve. And in the gap closing startup world, we're talking about founders who bring their lived experience, something that shaped them, an obstacle that kept their family back, and that they are determined to solve it so that other families don't suffer what they suffered. And so just an incredible amount of inspiration. At the seed stage, it's an idea, it's, you know, it's a little bit of a prototype, but there's not a whole lot of data to dig into. And that makes it much more interesting, I think.
Makes it more interesting, and I imagine it's easier for these companies to adopt the founder's commitment when they're still building, versus you've used the example of turning around a cruise ship compared to a canoe.
Exactly.
If we're thinking about company size.
Exactly. No, it's much easier to bake in a commitment to a great culture, a commitment to a diverse team, gap closing, becoming a public benefit corp. All of those things that we advocate for are much easier to bake in from the beginning.
Easier to bake in at the beginning, but in this moment, before we started recording, we were talking about the backslide. And it's been going on for a few years. We saw an increase in diversity initiatives following the murder of George Floyd in 2020. Yes. But in the past 2 years, there have been a loss of more than 2,600 DEI jobs in corporate America alone. We've seen the acronym DEI become really a volatile word, if I may, this year. What's been your experience, and what are you hearing from the founders in your portfolio or prospective founders? Are they looking to pull back on diversity?
Unquestionably, this is a difficult time. It is a backsliding moment. It is one of those valleys to contrast with the peaks. But there is still a solid commitment amongst many corporations, large corporations, and in the tech community to the principles. I do think it's worth taking a look at what people have found about DEI that went too far, and is there any substance there? So I think having a commitment to building a diverse team and an inclusive culture is primarily good business. From the beginning, and with our founders' commitment in 2016, we said, look, this is not a quota. This is not performative nonsense. This is to be customized. So we said to each and every founder, we want your employees to look like your customers. I can't think of anything offensive about that. I can't think of anything but what a great business principle about that. And so some of it is the narrative. How do we explain what we're doing and why we're doing it? And there's a range of approaches to DEI, just as there's a range of everything else. And I think there are probably some DEI practices that maybe weren't in a business's best interest, but by and large, the fundamental principles are consistent with creating long-term, sustainable, great businesses.
We often see that female founders or female founders of color are more capital efficient when they're running their companies, which create more resilient businesses. And yet, I've heard you speak in the past year or so about concern about some of these underrepresented founders in this environment who might be attracting less investment as they're are pullbacks in DEI. What are you doing about this, or what can you do about this, especially if you are just one investor on the cap table, but this underrepresented founder is struggling in this environment?
Well, we've always cared about supporting founders. We've never been in the standard Silicon Valley model of you look for one home run out of 10 and you kill off the other 9. I find that fundamentally offensive. If we're backing gap-closing businesses that do good in the world and that create great jobs, why would we want to help kill them off? So we try to support all the founders. Not all of them are going to be great for financial returns, but we're going to try to support all the founders. Platform services have always been important to us, and we want to look at the lived experience that brought these founders their understanding of what problem they're solving. Also sometimes comes with some baggage, and we want to support them through that. We want to create a safe space for our founders. We want to create support when there are messages from the outside world that say, you're not worthy. That's a hard message that we know as women to take in, that say you shouldn't be here. And so what do we do to counteract those negative messages, and what's the practical business support? How do we build a community of entrepreneurs to support each other? We work very hard to not invest in competitive businesses, and then we're in about 30 funds. And so we bring our GPs together. We do GP convenings, and we have them learn from each other. We bring in LPs, and we have the LPs talk to them about what they're looking for in a fund. We have founders, successful founders, come in and say, there's a lot of people that want to be on my cap table. Here's what I'm looking for in an investor.
When you spoke to Forbes in 2022, you said that one of the great myths of venture capital is that there's some value neutrality investing. Investors try to let themselves off the hook by saying, oh, we don't have anything to do with that. We're just here to make money. But you say making money is a value. It doesn't hide all sins, but it funds all sins. What does that mean?
Oh, goodness. I still believe that. I don't think there is such a thing as value neutrality when you're investing. I believe that the pursuit of financial returns only, what I lovingly call greed-only investing, is itself a value. And it says, we want to make money no matter how we make it, no matter how many people are harmed in the process, no matter how much inequality is fostered by this company or by this investment. I don't think that's good for investing. I don't think that's good for society. I don't think that's good values. So I think that all investing, I think all companies, in the same way that all investing is values-based, good values, bad values, mixed values, I think that all companies are impact companies. Negative impact, neutral impact, positive impact. And that we ought to talk about bringing the whole picture in. This idea that there's externalities and we don't count them is absurd to me.
That's a really good point. I'm thinking also about what you've said about philanthropy, and this kind of ties into money having a value. Can you talk about the 95% versus the 5%, especially for folks who maybe run a philanthropy?
Great question. Endowments are an increasingly important source of capital for GPs, for venture capital funds, that then, of course, in turn, fund startups. But how philanthropy has operated traditionally is this 95-5 problem, as I think about it. 95% is their investment. And usually the chief investment officer is in a world separate from the program officers. And so with the 5%, we are fighting poverty, or we're educating low-income kids, or we're feeding the hungry, or we're fighting climate change. But 95% over here, the chief investment officers are evaluated based on one and only one criterion: how much money they make. And so they're over here, they're not talking about the program manager's concerns, they're not talking about the mission of the foundation, they're singularly focused on making money. So if 95% of your money goes into investing in things that promote climate change rather than fighting it, that increase gaps between haves and have-nots instead of reducing poverty, and 5% goes over here to programs that fix it. Who's going to win in the 95-5? So we're trying to get foundations to invest consistent with mission, and part of that is to compensate chief investment officers and their teams for both their impact and their financial returns.
So that sounds like your mission for the next 50 years or more, next 70 years or more. But since we are talking for the 50 over 50, I have a few questions that we like to ask everyone, and I'll start with this one. Is being over the age of 50, over the age of 70, an advantage or disadvantage in your line of work?
Well, from my perspective, it's an advantage. From the external world, it's a disadvantage. And so juggling those things is often a concern.
Interesting. How do you juggle those things?
Well, in a few ways. One is I try to put myself in positions where my experience or my perspective is helpful. And one of the things I can do is to mentor and lift up younger women, and that's a huge joy.
Speaking of younger women, what would you tell women in their 20s or 30s who feel like they have to rush to accomplish everything they want to before the age of 40 or even before the age of 30?
Well, slow down, girl. Look, I'm here in my 70s. Your life expectancy, if you're in your 20s or 30s, probably is into 100. And so think about what you want to accomplish in different phases. Think about how to live with yourself for the long term. When you put your head on your pillow at 20 or 30 or 50 or 80, what are you going to be proud of?
We talked about how your activism started as a preteen, picketing for farm workers. Did that preteen Freada ever imagine her career after the age of 50? And if so, what did she think her older self would be doing? I don't know. 50 seemed like remote to a middle schooler, but I thought that I wanted to be a lawyer. And at that age, I thought, okay, that's a way to make things better, to fight for the marginalized. And then I learned that the law doesn't always coincide with fairness. And I was more interested in fairness than in following the rule of law everywhere it went. And so now you are working to secure fairness for the world's entrepreneurs.
Exactly.
Freada Kapor Klein, thank you so much for sitting down with us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity.